image bearers in this era of unrest and terror and anti-fill in the blank. Silence is the nail, the tired treads of justice, slowly draining life, but no patch will suffice. We'll change the whole thing so justice can stay on the move and humanity.
My name is John King, Secretary of Education under President Obama, and now President of the Education Trust. We must tackle the issue of racial disparities in school discipline. Disproportionate suspensions for Blacks translate into a higher likelihood of being held back, a lower likelihood of graduating from high school, and a higher likelihood of being involved in the criminal justice system. Lots of folks wrote statements of solidarity last spring with the movement for racial justice. But we have to tackle discipline disparities if we're serious about the idea that Black lives matter.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and so glad we're able to have you here today for this important convening and discussion around issues facing Black students in education. My name is Luke Wood, and I have the pleasure of serving with a team of people who are here today to talk to you about how we can best advance and reduce issues of exclusionary discipline facing our Black students. I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint as we get rolling here and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Frank Harris III. Frank is a professor at San Diego State University in post-secondary education and a scholar focused on Black issues facing Black boys and men in education, and he's going to get us rolling. Frank?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Luke. Good afternoon for those of you who are joining us on the West Coast, and I think it's good evening to those of you who are east of us. As Luke shared, I am Dr. Frank Harris III and serve as a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. And I have the pleasure of co-presenting this webinar with several colleagues who I will introduce shortly. So our plan for today's webinar is to begin by providing some initial framing and context regarding why Black children experience inequitable discipline in our schools. After that discussion, we will share some key data and narratives that provide a more transparent picture of the status of equity within our schools for Black children. And then we will have an expert panel of respondents who will provide commentary and reaction to the data and the narratives that we present. Before beginning the details of our webinar, I think it would be an appropriate time to thank and acknowledge the organizations that have graciously sponsored this webinar, including the California chapter of the NAACP, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, the Southern California chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, the Children's Advocacy Institute, Parents United to Restore Our Schools, Conscious Campus, the Association of African American Educators in San Diego, Black Men for Educational Equity, the Equity Lab, the Black Youth Leadership Project, the Urban League of Greater Sacramento County, the African American Male Education Network and Development, which we often refer to as AMEN, the National Black Child Development Institute, Sierra Health Foundation, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, and the Urban League of San Diego County. We also would like to thank and extend appreciation to the National Association for the Education of Young Children for helping to promote this event as well. Next slide. As I shared earlier, we have a distinguished panel of respondents and a moderator who will be joining us in today's webinar. And those colleagues include Dr. Melina Abdullah, who's a professor of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Los Angeles, Dr. Tyrone C. Howard, who's a professor of education and the Pitzer Family Endowed Chair in Education at the University of California, Los Angeles. We have Dr. Shirley Weber, who is the Secretary of the State of California. We also have Dr. Daniel Lee, who's the Deputy Superintendent of Equity in the California Department of Education. And of course, the moderator will be Kiana Williamson, who is the editor of the Equity Lab and is affiliated with the Sacramento Bee. Joining me as presenters will be my colleagues, Dr. J. Luke Wood, who's a distinguished professor of education at San Diego State University, and Dr. Joseph Johnson, who's executive director of the National Center for Urban School Transformation at San Diego State University. Is also the provost emeritus and a professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University as well. And so just delighted and honored to be able to share this virtual stage with these esteemed group of colleagues. Next slide. And so to officially provide a formal welcome to today's webinar, I would like to introduce our state superintendent of public instruction, Dr. Tony Thurman. Tony Thurman is the state superintendent of public instruction. And in this role, he is responsible for the largest public school system in the nation with more than 6 million students and more than 10,000 schools. Since taking office, State Superintendent Thurman has made improving equity, access, and opportunity for California's public school students his top priority. He has created initiatives that are focused on closing the achievement gap for our state's most vulnerable students and is dedicated to supporting educators and delivering an equitable education to all students. During his 4-year tenure in the Assembly, Dr. Thurman authored legislation that successfully expanded the free lunch program, bilingual education, and the Chafee Grant College Scholarship Program for foster youth. We are honored that Dr. Thurman has joined us today and deemed that this topic is one of importance and worthy of his time and attention. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Thurman.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris, and thank you, Dr. Wood, for this opportunity to provide just some brief remarks. Greetings to everyone, wherever you are in California or beyond. I hope that you continue to stay safe and well as we continue to work through this pandemic and the pandemic of racism that impacts so many things, including the subject of our topic today, disproportionality as it relates to African-American students and discipline and suspensions. You know, it's hard for me to imagine how a child as young as being preschool age could be suspended or expelled from school. Yet that is the case that we see. There is a trend where our babies are literally pushed out of school, and that continues through elementary school, middle school, and high school. And it's why I'm grateful for today's panel and the conversations that we will hear from Drs. Wood and Johnson and Weber, Abdullah, Howard, Lee, and Harris. Great names, great leaders to help us. And I'm looking forward to the recommendations that come out of the Reactor panel, because we have to have the political will to make the changes that are required to make sure that our babies aren't pushed out of school. Black minds matter. And let us move swiftly to give them the support and the attention that they need. And know, Dr. Harris, Dr. Wood, and others on this distinguished panel, that you will have the full support of the California Department of Education. It breaks my heart that we are still having this conversation in 2021. Because years ago, when I served on a school board, we used programs like restorative justice to reduce suspensions by 27% in 1 year. But yet here we are still talking about it. And as we're in the pandemic, we know that sometimes our students are suspended simply because they haven't turned their computer on. We must reverse course. We must provide the interventions that are needed. We hope that you'll follow the work that we've led, and you'll hear about it from my colleague, Dr. Daniel Lee, who will be representing us today on the panel, as well as our Chief Deputy Superintendent, Dr. Gregson. We're all working together on a work group that I've reestablished to focus on solutions to reducing disproportionate suspensions. We're engaged in conversations with many of our superintendents who found success and caused success to happen. We also want you to follow our work. We've launched a campaign early in 2020 to address implicit bias in many of our schools, funded by the Bechtel Foundation, supported by our partners at the National Equity Project to help us address bias. We followed up on that by providing grants in a series that we call Education to End Hate, so that our schools can address hate and racism and every form of prejudice directly, and equity grants that we provided to our districts so they have resources for professional development to support our staff so that they can be supportive of our students. We hope that many of you will follow our grants that we have just released and will apply by deadline in March for the grants that allow districts to have dollars for restorative justice and reducing chronic absenteeism. To date, our office has provided some $93 million in what I call an AB 1014 grants. These are grants that are taken away from the criminal justice system and repurposed to help keep our kids in school and to help them have a successful path. We hope that you will apply for these grants and that you'll follow our work to expand the pipeline of male educators of color in California. We're working on legislation to help expand funding for those programs because we know the difference that it makes when you have even just one educator of color. And if we have more male educators of color, we know that we will have bountiful impacts for our students. So we hope that you'll join our efforts. We look forward to the conversation that comes out of the Reactor panel. Let us all move swiftly together and have the political will to make the changes that we need to make to change the disproportionality for our African-American students and all students of color, because Black minds matter. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Tony. Really appreciate your words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Superintendent Thurman. Appreciate not only you being here, but also the passion and the seriousness with which you're taking this issue, as well as the other important work that you and your colleagues are leading in our state's Office of Public Education. So thank you, and we hope that you do see us as partners in this work as you continue to move forward on some of these key issues. Next slide, Luke. Okay, to provide some context and to help explain how we got to where we are today, Luke and I started this work on suspensions back in 2017 and released this monograph, Get Out, Black Male Suspensions in California Public Schools, with our colleague, Dr. Tyrone Howard, who's involved in today's events as well. And in this monograph, we presented data that transparently showed how boys of color experience inequitable discipline in our schools and provide some concrete implications for practice that are directed primarily at teachers, administrators, and policymakers to disrupt the practices that contribute to inequitable suspensions. In many respects, this monograph was inspired by my and Luke's work in the community colleges, where we consistently saw how men of color, men who were in their 20s and 30s, who talked about how their experiences with being disciplined in their K-12 schools continue to impact their relationship with educators, their intrinsic interest in education, and their self-efficacy as learners. In our qualitative work with men of color in community colleges, many of them disclosed that they hated school in their younger years and found it very easy to disengage and focus on other things because in school they were constantly being punished and singled out by educators as troublemakers, oftentimes for trivial infractions and at other times for things they had been accused of doing but had not done. Next slide. 2 years later, in 2019, we released 2 reports that focus on the rates of suspension for Black boys in Sacramento County, one titled The Capital of Suspensions, and the other, Outside Looking In, which looked at these same patterns for Black boys in our home county of San Diego. And one of the notable conclusions here was that Sacramento County had the #1 suspension district by totals in the state for Black kids, and that would be the Elk Grove district, and 4 of the top 20 districts in a total number of suspension for Black kids. So certainly some real challenges and disparities there that warrant urgent attention and need. Next slide. Last year in 2020, we released 2 more reports. When They Teach Us, which details patterns of suspension for Black children in San Diego County schools, and From Boarding Schools to Suspension Boards, in collaboration with our Indigenous colleagues. And in these reports, we noted that Black and Indigenous boys are the two groups that are most likely to be suspended in California public schools. And that brings us to today's panel and today's conversation. Next slide. All of the work that Luke and I and our colleagues who are joining here have been engaged in is informed by the perspective that we describe as equity-mindedness. This concept was created by Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, who's a recently retired professor of education, urban education at the University of Southern California about 2 decades ago. And it essentially encourages and helps educators to reframe student success as not being seen exclusively as an indicator of students' effort or students' performance, but rather foregrounding the role of schools, institutions, and educators in creating the conditions for inequities to be created and sustained. And to provide a more transparent picture of this concept, traditionally when educators are confronted with the type of data that we're going to talk about today, or some other indicators of student success that shows race-based disparities in student outcomes, it is not uncommon for many to ask questions like the ones you see presented here on the screen. Next slide. Conversely, when we look at these issues from an equity-minded perspective that prioritizes institutional responsibility and educators' accountability, we're more likely to begin conversations about the success and outcomes of children with questions like those that you see presented here. Next slide. We also have to recognize that school suspension and inequitable discipline are part of a larger concern of Black children being disproportionately impacted in our public schools. Disproportionate impact essentially occurs when a group of students do not have equitable access to the opportunities, information, resources, relationships, and networks that contribute to their success. So for example, we know that Black children in public schools nationally experience a range of stressors and trends that lead them to be disproportionately impacted. Many of them you see are represented here on the screen. I won't read each of them, but many of them have to do directly with patterns and practices related to suspensions and discipline. Others are more about academic program tracking, and others also deal with the perspectives that are held by educators about Black children. Regarding the latter point, next slide, educators' perspectives, Luke and I also developed this concept known as the 3D effect, in which we identified the 3 most prevailing stereotypes of students of color in education. The first D is we describe as distrust, which relates to the assumption that people of color are associated with being thugs, deviants, and criminals. Moving to the bottom right of the figure, the second D, disregard, relates to an ascription of intelligence. And this is when we assume that people of color are intellectually inferior to white students. And then finally, at the bottom left, we have disdain, which assumes that people of color come from families and communities that don't value education. The key point here is this, is that these stereotypes are often unconsciously held by educators and have an influence on the ways in which they teach and they serve students of color. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who's going to lead our discussion and presentation of key findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So what I want to do is begin my comments with a quote that we use all the time when we talk about these issues of suspension, and it's from Asa Hilliard. Asa Hilliard was an educational scholar. He was an Africana Studies scholar. He was a psychologist. He's really a sage across multiple fields who spent his life really looking at issues facing Black students in education. And after years and years of doing work, he concluded with the following statement, that I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. And ultimately, that's what this is all about, is to ensure that love is distributed equally to all of our students, including our Black students in education, who oftentimes are not treated with that type of respect. So to foreground this conversation, before we start showing some suspension data, we thought it would be important to shows some of the patterns that help to lead to the suspensions occurring themselves. And so what you see here on your screen on your right-hand side are some of the patterns that have come out of a project that my colleague and wife, Dr. Essien, have focused on. We have an ongoing project called the Our Voices Project, which collects narratives from the parents of Black children, but specifically Black children who are in preschool through 3rd grade. And overwhelmingly, what we've seen is that these patterns, when it comes to criminality, play out on a regular basis. First, they're assumed to be troublemakers. They are therefore then labeled with criminalized terms such as bad or aggressive or hyper or defiant. They're, as a result, more closely monitored and hyper-surveilled for wrongdoing. And then when something occurs, as would be normal for any other child, particularly even when it's age appropriate, they're singled out for discipline. When that occurs, that discipline can be harsher and more prolonged than what you'd see with other children. And they're oftentimes viewed through what's called a disorder-based lens. So they're viewed as having some sort of behavioral disorder. So I'm going to just show a few different quotes from parents that we see as part of this work. Again, this is from both my colleague, Dr. Essien, who helped serve as a coordinating manager for this event. So first theme is soon to be troublemakers. And here's just a couple examples that we see from the parents of Black children. And one parent, seen the assistant teacher going into a verbal battle with my son. As my son was trying to explain the situation, the teacher said, well, the other kids said you started it, and took his word for it without even trying to hear my son. So soon to be troublemakers, so then of course not listening to their perspectives. Going to the quote on the bottom, my child has never had an accident since being potty trained. They were sent to timeout and he wet himself. He told me he did tell the teacher he had to go, but she most likely assumed he was lying. When confronted about this, she didn't even mention that he was in a timeout, essentially lying on him. And so this is examples of parents expressing frustration around their children not being believed. Other examples of being viewed as a troublemaker are portrayed on this slide. One parent said, my son's teacher told me that she had moved him to a table up front. It was where she had moved the children that had difficulty paying attention or behaving. My son was getting distracted in class. When I came to visit, that front table was entirely populated by Black boys. I immediately demanded that he be moved. And we see these kinds of examples pretty frequently. In fact, we'll present another example later on that also speaks to this theme in this point. As I mentioned, the next theme is being labeled with criminalized terms as being troublemakers, bad, hyper, aggressive, physical, defiant. And here are some examples of how that has played out with young Black children. Again, these are children in early childhood education. One parent said, when my son was in the toddler room, we had a near 2-hour conference to discuss how busy he was, how he was physical with his friends. He was not even 2. Another parent said, the teacher repeatedly described my 7-year-old child as aggressive because he put his all into winning at sports and games. I had to interject numerous times reminding the teacher that my child is competitive, not aggressive. Another parent said, ever since my child has been about 2 to 3 years old, she's been referred to as aggressive, destructive, defiant, deregulated, hyperactive, distracted, and has been watched more closely than her peers. Again, after being assumed to be troublemakers and then labeled with these terms, some teachers then more closely monitor Black children for wrongdoing. One parent said, I would also witness them constantly watching my son. When I brought it up, they denied it. I explained that of course they would see him doing more things if they were watching him. I witnessed other children doing the same things and no one would even engage them. He was the only Black kid in the school. Another one that's on the bottom says, my son was bullied at school and I asked for an investigation into the school because they were not doing anything about it. This caused them to view every move he made, and he began to get in trouble for things his peers were not getting in trouble for because they were looking at him more closely. Being singled out is probably the largest theme that we've seen in the data that we have. And I should mention how many narratives we've had. We've collected data, narratives from now almost 700 parents of Black children. And here's an example of being singled out, where when other children are doing the same behaviors, Black children are then targeted and identified as the one who did wrong. One teacher said, my son's teacher yelled at my son for spilling a little paint. And mind you, it's washable paint. Other kids spilled it too, but it doesn't seem to bother them, only when the Black kids do it. Another parent said, in first grade, my son was regularly sent home with notes regarding minor infractions. When I questioned him, he mentioned how 3 or 4 other boys later discovered that they were also doing the same things. They didn't get into trouble. Another example is the third one. An incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed out a rainbow and about 3 or 4 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. He can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out when 4 other kids see the pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair. They're also more likely to be subject to harsher punishments and more prolonged punishments. The first parent said, when he is disciplined, it seems harsher, more stern than his non-colored counterparts who participated in the same events. There seems to be some fear from the administration. They see through the lens of he's a danger. The next one says, my son's first grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe for even a small thing and didn't match the crime, such as turning around in his seat one time would result in the whole day being marked as bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. And the third example of this is my child was in second grade and he made a joke. His teacher yelled at him and made him cry and said, second grade is no place for jokes. She then made him stand in front of the class, and the teacher and her associate continued to yell at him and call him a clown. He continued to cry and they continued to yell at him. And then the last pattern that we see as a very recurrent pattern is being viewed through a disorder-based lens, where children are assumed to have some sort of underlying disorder. One example is on the top where they have asked if she has a behavior disorder, and it has been suggested that she has ADHD. Ever since she's been 2 to 3 years old, she has been suspended anywhere between 2 to 10 days at a time. Next one, going to the one and the third one down. When my daughter started kindergarten, we had a teacher mention that she thought my daughter had ADHD and would need special services for her attention. It turns out that our daughter had only been in her class for a short period of time. There are about 5 to 6 other children who are African American. All of them were placed at the same desk in the back of the class and were referred to special education services. These are examples of what we see that help to illuminate why we see some of the challenges and patterns that you'll see in the actual data. So today we released a report titled Suspending Our Future: How Inequitable Disciplinary Practices Disenfranchise Black Kids in California's Public Schools. On the bottom of the screen, you can see the access link to this. I would encourage everyone to download the report, to share it. Please do so on social media. We want people to be able to see it. We want people to be able to read it so that we can be able to move forward and being able to address the issues that are facing our students. So please screenshot it, share it, and please help us support us in getting this out. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about before getting into suspensions was to talk about its associated counterpart, and that is expulsions. So expulsions, of course, is when a kid is removed more permanently from the learning environment, unlike a suspension that's for a temporary period of time. If you look on data from the state of California, based from the California Department of Education from 2018 and 2019, the expulsion rate for African American students was 19%. In contrast, the expulsion rate for all students was at 0.8%, meaning that the expulsion rate for African American students was 2.4 times higher. You'll also notice that the expulsion rate for Native American students is even higher than that. When we disaggregate the data, you'll note that most of those data are related to Native American boys. And across our work, we've been able to partner with colleagues from the Native American community looking at these issues. And one thing that we have seen is this: is that when you're talking about issues of suspension, the highest rates are invariably Black boys. But when you're talking about the highest rates of expulsion, the rates tend to be for Native American boys. The other thing that we looked at in this report that we think is of critical importance is the use of restraint and exclusions as a form of discipline. And this is based upon the most recent data that's available. And it's incomplete data based upon the fact that COVID-19 occurred in the 1920 school year, but it does give us insight if we look to it at instead of looking at just total percentages, to look at proportional representation. So in terms of proportional representation, Black students in the state of California account for 5.3% of the enrollment. So think about it, 5.3%. Yet, if we're talking about a child who has been subject to a mechanical restraint could be a number of different things. If you look across the country, it can be a chair that students are strapped to immobilize them. It can be handcuffs or very similar types of mechanical devices. It can be a wrap mat. But if they count for 5.3% of the population, yet account for 31.4% of mechanical restraints. In addition, we see that in terms of physical restraints, they account for 18% of those, 18.6% to be exact. So what that means is that could be an educator who comes behind them and holds their arms behind their back to immobilize their body, their arms, their head, and their bodily movement. And the last one that was data as it relates to seclusions. Seclusions refer to putting a child into a room and then essentially making it so that they are unable to leave that room. A seclusion is essentially locking a child in a room or an area for a temporary period of time. Again, Black children account for 5.3% of the enrollment, but 24% of seclusions. We think that these are all, of course, indicative of underlying patterns that begin often with the issues that we talked about with those narrative data and the data that you're about to see regarding suspensions. So if we look across the state of California on your far left-hand side, in 2018, 2019, which is the first year that we had a full set of data, the suspension rate for all students across the board was 3.5%. And that's an important number. Remember that, 3.5%, because everything else should be looked at in comparison to that when we're looking at overall groups. So at the state level, we can see that the statewide average for all groups is 3.5%, but for Black students is 9.1%. When that data is disaggregated by gender, we see that Black boys are suspended at a 11.8% rate, 11.8% rate. Such a high rate really only followed by that of Native American boys. Again, why we think that oftentimes conversations on BIPOC or Black Indigenous people of color need to be interlinked. Now, when we move further into this data, we also recognize that there are differences across grade levels. So the statewide suspension rate, for example, if you look at the blue bars, is the highest for students in middle school, regardless of race, regardless of gender, it's in middle school. And that's a 6.7% rate. However, the highest suspension rate across all grade levels is for Black males in middle school at 19.1%, meaning that roughly 1 in every 5 are suspended at least one time. That's an unduplicated suspension. So at least one time in a given year. That's not counting a student who's suspended multiple times in that year, a student who's suspended in 7th grade and then 8th grade. It's just an unduplicated suspension rate. Now we see that the highest rates, again, are in middle school, but we also want to look at the difference between Black children, and in this case, in this chart, this next one I'm going to show you, Black boys in comparison to their same grade counterparts. So when we look at those data, we would look at, for example, the orange bar in comparison to the blue bar to determine what is the level of overrepresentation. And when we look at this, what we find is that the highest rates of the suspension disparity is not in high school, it's not in middle school, it's not even in latter elementary. It's in early childhood education, kindergarten through 3rd grade, where Black boys are 522% more likely to be suspended than their peers. The highest disproportionality ratio at any grade level. We also, when we look at this data, think it's important to identify different subgroups and how they're experiencing this. And so we look at foster youth as a key group that we see as significantly overrepresented. Now, one of the things that you'll see is with looking at first the blue bars, the statewide average, remember that the suspension rate across the state is 3.5%. So lower income students are slightly more likely to be suspended. Students with disabilities are more likely to be suspended. Students who are unhoused are also more likely to be suspended. But the highest suspension rate is for students who are foster students. And I myself am a former foster child, so when I see this data, it's particularly concerning. And what we find is that across the board, foster children are suspended, but even more so when we're talking about Black male foster children at 26.9%. But if you start to look at this and look at some of the different layers and say, let's look at Black males who are foster youth in grades 7th and 8th, the statewide suspension average is actually 35.8%. Again, these are children who are under the custody of the state to provide them with safety and support and to provide for their general welfare. Now, when we look, as again, I said, across all foster groups, we see this as an issue. Now, for African-American foster students, this is even more pronounced. On this chart, we have it broken down for all foster students, but not disaggregated by race and gender, but simply looking at race. And we can see that there's some pretty concerning challenges that are occurring. Now, the other thing that we thought would be important to share is data on charter schools. Now, one of the things that you'll see immediately as you look at this chart are that charter schools typically have suspension rates that are lower than that of traditional public schools. And in fact, if you look at Black students, even the disproportionality ratio is lower in comparison between charter schools and public schools, or traditional public schools, I should say. Now, we don't believe that this is necessarily a function of the fact that charter schools are doing better in this area, but really that charter schools have different ways of measuring attendance and can have different structures that can lead to these issues being less evident, meaning that they're occurring, but you can't necessarily see it. For example, charter schools offering independent study programs may informally suspend students for multiple days without any reduction in daily attendance because their funding is based upon work productivity, not attendance. Thus, a student could be given a work packet and informally suspended from school for, say, 4 days. Yet, if the packet is turned in, regardless of the quality of work that's completed, the student in the school still receives that funding. This can lead to students being suspended, falling behind in their studies, and ultimately leaving charter schools to enter the juvenile court system. This occurs because student attendance is not required in many independent study programs. As a result, you'll see that we have a recommendation that specifically speaks to this issue. Now what we want to do is talk about some of the highest suspension counties. Now, when we look at total suspensions and specifically looking at unduplicated suspensions, we see that the highest suspension county is Los Angeles, followed by Sacramento. Now, in our reports, we have termed Sacramento the capital of suspensions, and the reason for that is this. It has the second highest total suspensions, but you have to also put that in context to the actual suspension rate. So for example, you'll note that the cumulative enrollment in Los Angeles Unified for Black children is 114,000 in comparison to 30,000 in, I said Los Angeles Unified, I meant county, in comparison to 30,000 in, say, Sacramento County. So despite that, the difference really between them is not proportional. And so that's why we have focused on Sacramento as a key site for these issues. But you can look at total suspension numbers, but that oftentimes ignores smaller counties like you see here on this slide, that while they have a smaller percentage of Black students, they have higher suspension rates. We don't believe that that means that those issues should be ignored. In fact, we believe that it makes it even more concerning because these students are in isolated locales, oftentimes with the County Office of Education not having the same level of oversight and support. And so you see, for example, Modoc County, there's only 16 Black students enrolled, but 25% of them were suspended, right? Same thing for Amador County, Glenn County, Madera County, and Plumas County. And so what we do is when we look at counties that are concerning, we look at a combination. And so what we would say is if you want to hone in on counties, look at this chart here. This represents a combination of top suspension schools, as well as schools that have high, or counties rather, as well as counties that have high total suspensions and high suspension rates as well. So any county that you see on this list should be a concern. Let's now look at districts and districts that have high suspension rates. And doing the same thing, we see that if we look at total unduplicated suspensions, that the highest in total suspensions district in the state of California for Black students is Elk Grove Unified in Sacramento County. And in fact, Sacramento County has 4 of the top 20 suspension districts. And we've seen this before in our other reports as well, including Sacramento City Unified, including Twin Rivers Unified and San Juan Unified. We also see high total suspensions in Oakland Unified and Fresno Unified. But again, you also should look at suspension rates. And so when we look at districts with high suspension rates, we see that it is the Sutter County Office of Education at 30.8%. It is Modoc Joint Unified at 8%, Bayshore Elementary at 27.8%. These are incredibly high suspension rates when, again, if we recognize that the statewide average is only 3.5%. And so on this chart, we've amalgamated it together so you can see what this looks like. Again, taking into account both high suspension rates and high total suspensions in combination. And so this would be the chart that we would suggest is the one to focus in on most intently. And what you'll see here are dark red are the top 20 for both suspension rates and top suspension totals. The light red is top 50 for suspension rates and suspension totals. And the ones in tan are those that are just based upon incredibly high suspension rates. Again, we think it's important to look at all of these when making a comprehensive assessment about where these issues are. Now let's turn to high suspension schools, and we'll go through this a little bit quicker so we can get to some of the recommendations of conversation with our reactor panel. So we look at high suspension schools. Again, we start out with total unduplicated suspensions, and we see that it includes Deer Valley High in the Contra Costa County, Central Juvenile Hall in Los Angeles County. And in fact, you'll notice that if you go through these schools, that many of them are, when we talk about the highest total suspension schools, do fall in a designation of non-traditional schools. So juvenile court schools, community day schools. And so we'll show you charts that look like this, as well as ones that focus specifically on traditional public schools. But if we look across the top 100 suspension schools, more than half of them are traditional schools. And many of them are, of course, in larger counties like Los Angeles and Fresno and Contra Costa and Sacramento and San Bernardino. These are the top 20 suspension schools in the state of California, starting out with Stara Anderson Community Day School, a K through 6, that's kindergarten through 6th grade school, that spends 92.3% of their Black students. You'll note that the only school on here that is a quote unquote traditional public school is the one highlighted in yellow, Hoover Herbert Middle School, which has a 59% suspension rate. If we pull out suspension schools that are non-traditional schools, what we find is the list here, which are the top 100 suspension schools for Black students in California. Again, with Herbert Hoover leading the pack, followed by C.A. Jacobs Intermediate, Aspire Lionel, Wonderful College Prep, Vox Collegiate, and numerous others. You'll notice that none of them on this slide has suspension rates below 39%, when again, the statewide average, it's only 3.5%. And this is the next set of schools that also fit this high suspension designation. So we have recommendations that we think are important in terms of being able to address these issues. First, we believe it's important to require school principals to consult with a social worker before suspending a foster child. We believe it's important to do this because right now, if a child is suspended for 5 or more days, they are legally required to consult with the social worker or the child's court-appointed attorney. But for less than those 5 days, that's not what occurs. Second, we believe it's important to report voluntary and involuntary transfer data because that's where a lot of expulsions are occurring, where students are being encouraged to go from one school to another as a way of doing an informal suspension. Like, wouldn't this school be a better fit? Or we wouldn't want to suspend. Would you like to consider bringing your child to this other school? And so oftentimes some educators frame this in ways to parents and to students to make them think that they're doing them a favor when in fact we don't believe that they are. We also believe it's important to require training for all pre-service and in-service teachers on bias, implicit bias, on microaggressions, on inclusive teaching practices, on positive behavioral interventions. We also think it's important to eliminate suspension and expulsions in early learning, and I'll talk more about that. But when we think about children in preschool, and as Superintendent Thurman mentioned, when we're talking about suspensions and expulsions in preschool, like, why is that a conversation? That is something that disproportionately impacts, we know, Black children, but unfortunately, because of how collected across the state, it's very difficult to be able to present that type of information here. We also think it's important to extend the ban on willful defiance suspensions for all elementary students. Right now, it's only for K-3 students. We recommend, in addition, to establish grade level suspension requirements that are age appropriate. We've been and worked with districts where they have one set of suspension requirements. So for example, a child can be viewed as being disruptive for tapping a pencil on a desk or turning around in their chair. Those can be being disruptive. Now, maybe there's an argument about what that might look like in high school, but when we're talking about children in kindergarten, that is a age appropriate behavior. And so we think there has to be guidelines that are also age appropriate. There is a need to prohibit in-school and out-of-school suspensions that are hidden. Hidden in-school suspensions occur when a child is moved out of the learning environment, but it's not documented. Or out-of-school suspensions can also occur in the same way when a parent is called and encouraged to come pick up their child early and did not bring them back for a day or so. Or they're at home and encouraged not to bring them back already. And basically, what's occurring there is that it's a hidden in-school suspension, a hidden out-of-school suspension, but it's being documented as an absenteeism. Make suspension data publicly available on district and school websites. When we think about higher education, the Student Right to Know Act, on colleges' websites, they have to publish data on their success rates as disaggregated by certain groups. We think the same thing needs to be available on every district and school website for their suspension data as disaggregated. We also think it's important to reduce attendance monies for schools when students receive an out-of-school suspension. Now, let's say a student is suspended for 3 days. They're sent home on Monday and they're gone Tuesday and Wednesday. The school does lose the ADA monies for Tuesday and Wednesday, but whether or not they're there for 5 minutes or 5 hours on Monday, they do keep those monies. And so that's a loophole that we think has to be explored, because what will happen then is a child can be sent home for that day and return the following day. It's a suspension. There's a loss of service that's actually being provided, but the school still receives the ADA. And lastly, I've already mentioned the concerns around implementing charter school funding models that reduce attendance monies for students who are suspended. And this is where I'd want to point everyone's attention here to two key efforts that are occurring right now. First is Black Men for Educational Equity, led by Kai Jackson and a number of other wonderful individuals, has been working with Cadango on a bill that is being carried by Assemblymember Rubio that is going to be introduced very shortly to eliminate suspensions and expulsions in preschool. The number for Assemblymember Rubio's office is on the bottom of your screen. If you have an organization that you think wants to support this, please call. If you believe that that it's important for us to eliminate suspensions and expulsions in preschool, please call. Reach out to myself, reach out to Kai, and I'd also like to note that both myself and Joe Johnson Jr., who will be presenting after us, are part of Black Men for Educational Equity, along with a number of other very wonderful gentlemen. On the right-hand side of your screen, I point your attention to another effort that's underway, and that is Assembly Bill 740. And this would require a principal to consult the child's social worker or attorney prior to suspending a child who is in foster care. You can join this effort and learn more by going to bmmcoalition.com, and we'll continue to provide updates and information on that website. Or you can also call the Capitol office for the Assembly member who's carrying this bill and encourage them to continue to do so. And also, if you have an organization that wants to be involved, please do so. And this bill is being co-sponsored by Black Minds Matter Coalition. That's us, that's this group. the Children's Advocacy Institute, the Children's Law Center, and is also supported by the statewide NAACP. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank, who's going to take us home, and then turn it over to Joe Johnson Jr.
Thank you. Excellent job, Luke, as always. So I know we're a little bit pressed for time, so I'm going to move through these. Of the 6 that are here, I'm going to highlight 4 of them. So these recommendations are intended for families and parents and guardians of Black children who have a concern about discipline and suspension in their schools. The first, our SDSU colleague, Dr. Andre Branch, once advised that you never leave your child in an unhealthy environment for the sake of a quote unquote good education. When you read the report, that's the companion report for this webinar, you will find that there are many schools, and I think Luke presented this as well, with high suspension rates that are actually considered, quote, high quality schools with a rigorous academic curriculum. Yet having a high quality academic environment does not mean that the ethos of the school is welcoming, inclusive, or healthy for Black children. Second, historically, and I would say this has sort of been the trend in Black communities, there has been a great deal of trust and respect for schools and educators. Growing up as someone in the South, right? I mean, I often remember my grandmother saying, hey, whatever happens at the school, whatever the teacher says, whatever the principal says, right? That's the law. That's what it is. And so I think during those times when we're told that our child did something, the inclination is to believe what the school is saying. Because the assumption is that an educator always acts in the best interest of the child. But this is something that we can no longer take for granted. If your child has been suspended, first talk with your child to learn what happened from their perspectives. Then follow up with the leadership of the school to make sure that what you learn from your child is aligned with what the school knows and assumes. And if other children are involved, make sure the school has done a thorough and their due diligence in investigating their roles and making sure that whatever may have occurred as well. Third, oftentimes when we're involved in conversations like the one we're having today, many educators are actually surprised to learn about the patterns of suspension that are present within their schools and within their districts. So if your child attends a school with high rates of suspension, share the data and the report with them. Share with the PTA, share with the school site council or other advocacy groups that are affiliated with the school. Connect with other Black families at the school. Request a meeting with the administration to find out what proactive steps they're planning to take to address the inequitable discipline of Black children. And then finally, do not allow an educator to label your child as a problem or a bad kid. You know, once this occurs, that educator no longer has your child's best interest and is no longer personally invested in their success. You need to remove your child from the care of that educator and demand that they no longer work with their child. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe, Dr. Johnson.
Yes, and then just briefly, I want to introduce Joseph Johnson Jr. He is the founding executive director for the National Center for Urban School Transformation at San Diego State University. He's also a professor emeritus of educational leadership, the former dean of the College of Education, and also previous interim provost and senior vice president at San Diego State University.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both Dr. Wood and Dr. Harris. It is an honor to be a part of this event. Dr. Harris, perhaps you can enable my screen sharing. While he is doing so, I just want to thank both Dr. Wood and Dr. Harris for allowing me to be a part of this event. I'm so proud to be associated with both of these gentlemen. I'm proud not only because of their scholarly accomplishments, but I'm proud of the manner in which they have built springboards to launch the success of so many scholars of color. And it is very much an honor to be a part of this event. So I am going to share now a little from the perspective of my center, the National Center for Urban School Transformation. And as I do so, I want to acknowledge that our center is all about identifying and studying schools across the nation where we see multiple evidences of high achievement for every racial ethnic group and low suspension and expulsion rates for every racial ethnic group. These are certainly schools with challenges. They are typical schools, but they are also schools that are achieving atypical results. They have all of the challenges that might be associated with urbanicity. They are certainly a part of bureaucracies. They are dealing with many of the challenges associated with poverty and racism, yet they are achieving very different outcomes in terms of suspension and expulsion, and they are achieving very different results in terms of academic achievement. And so if you listen to all of the findings that Dr. Wood and Harris shared, and then you look at the findings from our study of these very successful schools, one has to ask the question of, well, what can be predicted based on race? Because fundamentally, this is all about how our systems are resulting in specific outcomes for students based on race. And this leads me to a couple of quotes. One, a quote that I have shared often. In fact, one of my friends recently told me that his superintendent was getting tired of hearing me share this quote. And my response is, well, I'll stop sharing it when it stops being true. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So whether we're talking about those outcomes of suspension or expulsion impacting schools, school districts, states, the entire nation, systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results that they get. But I have a new favorite quote from Ibram Kendi that becomes important when we look at these issues of systemic impact and see that they have racist outcomes. And so what Kendi tells us is that there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist is not racist. The opposite is anti-racist. And so when we take these two quotes together, it helps us recognize that we, as leaders within systems, have to think about what is it about our systems that make it such that one can predict results based on race. And so to me, that leads to three questions that are fundamental in today's discussion. How do leaders change systems in ways that disrupt those processes that make Black students likely to fail? How do leaders change systems in ways that create processes that make Black students likely to succeed? And then the combination of those. How do leaders change systems so that schools become anti-racist? And as you listen to what I'm going to share, I am going to be focusing hugely on the issue of leaders. And when I say leaders, I'm talking about district leaders. I'm talking about school level leaders. I'm also talking about teacher leaders. All of those leaders share roles in creating systems that will disrupt those processes that are resulting in Black students being suspended, expelled, excluded, disregarded, distrusted. As well, those leaders can work together in ways that change systems in ways that make it likely for Black students to succeed behaviorally, academically, in every kind of way, in ways that empower Black students to succeed in life. So how do leaders do this? What is it about these schools that NCUST has been studying that results in very low suspension rates for Black students and very high levels of success for Black students? Well, one issue is that leaders influence students' access to challenging curricula. We can, as leaders, district leaders, school leaders, teacher leaders, we can create systems where somebody has a high likelihood of success. We can also create a system where somebody has a very low likelihood of success. And what we know about human beings is that people don't like to fail. And what we know is that we can create a system where somebody is more likely to just check out, to give up, to find a way to not have to be there. And I'm absolutely convinced that for many of our Black students, we have created curricula where Black students feel like they've been set up. They've been set up in a way where they are not likely to succeed. They've been set up in a way where what is being talked about doesn't relate to them, where they don't see a connection. And what we find in contrast in these very successful schools is leaders are working together to help create curricula where Black students see, hey, this is all about me. Whether we're talking about algebra, or we're talking about biology, or we're talking about chemistry, or we're talking about robotics, whatever it is, what we're seeing in those very successful schools is Black students understanding that just from the way this is being presented, the way it's being shared, the way it's being unpacked, this is something for me as well. I like to think of this as where the curricula is like a ladder. Now, we like to think that if you have a ladder, the ladder is leading somewhere. Well, for many Black students, they're not convinced that the ladder that's put in front of them in elementary school or in middle school or in high school will actually take them somewhere. And so the first issue is educators have to work together in a way to help students feel that that ladder does in fact take them somewhere. But then when we think of a ladder, we think of a ladder where the rungs are a reasonable distance apart and an even distance apart so that I have a chance of succeeding at getting to the next rung. Whereas in so many schools, what Black students find is that that first rung may be 4 feet away. And they're thinking, well, how am I going to reach that rung? And then how will I reach the next one after that? And they don't perceive that things were structured for their success. The next issue, though, is that in these very successful schools that we identify and study, we see that leaders have come together to work deliberately to think, well, how can we make it such that students, Black students, will perceive that the instruction that they're being provided is structured for their success. In one of the schools that I studied quite some time ago, I sat down with the school's principal and I said, 6 years ago, your school was in the pits. The state was about to close you down. And now you have the same demographics, but you have a very, very different situation. And where students are succeeding at these very high rates, and people like me are coming from all over the country to try to find out what's going on with your school. So give me the bottom line. Why is it that your school is so successful? And the principals shared, well, back then we taught school like we were feeding the chickens. And I said, excuse me? And he said, well, you know about feeding chickens, don't you? And I said, well, explain. And he said, well, when you feed the chickens, you strap on your bag of feed, you go into the yard, you toss the feed. If the chickens get it, fine. And if they don't get it, fine. But after you've tossed it, you're done. Well, for so many Black students, they perceive that it's being tossed out there. And other students are meant to get it, but not them. And so at the end of the week, the teacher gives a quiz and puts the grade in the grade book and moves on. In contrast, in these very successful schools, what we see is school leaders, teacher leaders, district leaders working together to create an ethos where it's not done until we know that all the students have digested this information, that it's become a part of them, that they can actually use this. And so they're very deliberate in thinking about how can we create instruction that is going to engage our Black students? How can we create instruction that is going to motivate them, that is going to tap into their interests so that they have a high likelihood of success? This picture is from a wonderful little school in Ohio where Black students are achieving in amazing ways. And the gentleman who has his back to us wearing the black shirt, I had the opportunity to interview him. And he told me that he had been in another school and he had been expelled. And he told me about all the problems he had had and the struggles that he had. And then I said, well, but that's not the way it is here. And he said, oh, no. He said, I'm an honor student. He said, my report card since I've been here has been all A's and B's. This class that I was observing was an Algebra 2 class. And he was getting an A in Algebra 2. And I said, well, tell me what's the fundamental difference? And he said, well, at my old school, they would see me coming, referring to the teachers. And he crossed his arms like this. And he said, they would look at me and they would think, okay, here comes my next suspension. Here comes trouble. Here comes a future dropout. Here comes a future prison inmate. And he said, so when I got to this school, it was a totally different environment. He said, the teachers here, they see me coming. And then he uncrossed his arms and opened them up. And he said, they see me coming. And they look at me as if to say, here comes promise. Here comes a future graduate. Here comes somebody who is going to be somebody and contribute something important to his community. He said, that's why I'm successful here. The point is that we can create cultures in which Black students will not just survive, but thrive. We see this over and over again in those places where we see Black students excel. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by magic. It happens with intense effort and work, and it happens with work from those teacher leaders, those school leaders, and those district leaders coming together with the belief that it can happen. In these very successful schools, we don't just look at the numeric data. We talk to the students, we listen to them. And these are things that we hear from them. They know that they are in a place where educators have shaped the curricula so that they have a high likelihood of success. They know that folks have designed instruction so that they have a high likelihood of winning and winning big. They know that there is a culture where they belong, where they are embraced, where they are empowered. It is that challenging curricula, that effective instruction, and that transformational culture that combine in a way to make these schools so successful. So within our center, we're identifying these schools, we're studying these schools, but we're striving to support leaders in creating this kind of positive transformational culture. We have 2 new certificate programs that we are launching currently. one focused on principals, one focused on principal supervisors, where we're really wanting to work with individuals who want to come together in a way to make these kinds of changes happen. And so it's been certainly an honor to be a part of this conversation. And I look forward to hearing from the respondents. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. And with that, we will turn it over to our moderator for the panel, Simpson from the Equity Lab at the Sacramento Bee.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining the call. My name is Kiana Williamson, and I am the editor of the Sacramento Bee's Equity Lab. The research that was presented today really points to our failures. And they're failures that we not only have the power, but the obligation to find solutions for. This next panel of speakers, we not only have the minds, but you have the influence to find where in our systems we're upholding these structures, and to ideate and put into action new creative and progressive policy to carve a new future where our intentions are matching our actions, and where we are valuing Black students, Latino and Indigenous students, students from low-income families, and students in California's foster care systems. Joining me today is Dr. Shirley Weber, Secretary of State of California, Dr. Melina Abdullah, Professor of Pan-African Studies at CSULA and co-founder of the Los Angeles chapter of Black Lives Matter, Dr. Tyrone C. Howard, the Pritzker Family Endowed Chair and Professor of Education at UCLA, and Dr. Daniel Lee, Deputy Superintendent of Equity at the California Department of Education. Dr. Howard, I'd like to start with you. We have the data, we've seen the data, but we know that children's lives and their futures are much more than the numbers. And so I would like for you to talk to us about what's actually at stake here, especially for children who are receiving suspensions in early childhood education, and what happens if we do nothing.
First of all, thank you for having me here. Big shout out to my brothers Luke and Frank for this important convening. But the results are very clear. If we do nothing, we think we're in a bad state now, but the outcomes are not good at all. We know that if our young people don't get the kind of loving, caring, affirming education that they so desperately deserve, that their engagement with the juvenile justice system is enhanced. Their likelihood of being in carceral states is enhanced. The likelihood of them experiencing homelessness is enhanced. The likelihood that they'll find employability is diminished. All the indicators, political participation, engagement in their communities, overall life satisfaction are all significantly going to be compromised if they don't get the kind of education interventions that they have. And so the bottom line comes down to the fact that if we don't act now and act in a really robust and really, I think, radical way that does much of what we talk about the report, much of what Dr. Johnson talked about, we're gonna look back 10, 15 years from now and realize that we faced a real tipping point to do something different, do something bold, do something really imaginative for our young people, to make it centered around not just anti-racism, but anti-Black racism, and really call upon policies and procedures that contribute to that. And it will be, I don't want to say a lost generation, but a severely disadvantaged generation. And we just can't afford to see that happen.
Dr. Abdullah, you're a professor at CSULA, where only 30% or so of Black students who manage to make it through all of these obstacles in the way of their education are even eligible to attend once they graduate high school. Mainstream society will try to tell us that Black children and children of color are inherently disobedient or not as high achieving than their peers. We're not going to entertain those dated and racist ideas on this call. But if it's not the children, I'm curious as to who or what you believe is responsible.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And I'll say that beyond being a scholar and an organizer, I'm also a mom, and I have 3 children, and 2 of my 3 children experienced much of what was presented in this report. And even though I study this and I do work in this area, you always feel when it's your own child that maybe there's something else. And so this report and this data is really important for us to remember that there is the deliberate and intentional targeting of Black children in schools. And so when you say, why are our children not made ready for the university system? It's because systems have made a choice to sacrifice Black children, to target Black children, to criminalize Black children, to pipeline Black children for prisons and jails and low-wage jobs, rather than prepare them for universities and careers and entrepreneurship. And so I want to say that they have their plans. And I heard Dr. Johnson give one quote. I'll give another that parallels his, which is from Manning Marable and How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. He says that these systems are intentionally and deliberately designed to produce these outcomes. So this is not accidental. And because it's not accidental, because it's deliberate and intentional, we also have to be deliberate and intentional. We also have to say, well, they have their vision, they have their plans for our students, they have their plans for our children, because they are our children, whether they're biologically ours or not. But we also have our own plans. And so I just want to lift up an article that I dropped in the chat that yesterday, in Los Angeles, we saw the fruits of many years of labor that my daughters and others have been engaged in for at least the last 4 to 5 years to try to decriminalize, especially Black children in LAUSD schools, and do what we call Fund Black Futures. What we were successful in doing between June and yesterday is defunding LA School Police by 35%, getting a $25 million cut to that policing unit, which disproportionately not only suspends Black children, but targets them, traumatizes them, and terrorizes them. My now 14-year-old daughter, when she was 11, had police called on her in the classroom 8 times in one semester. The first time for having a look in her eye, another time for having slime in her pocket, which I can assure you every 6th grade child has slime in their pocket, right? And so what we were able to do, what the children were able to do, is get police moved off campus, but also to get a $25 million, that $25 million reallocated to specifically Black children in LA Unified School District, plus another 11 million added. So I'm lifting all this up to say that there's policy demands that we have to make. There's recommendations that we have to make. We absolutely have to back progressive legislation. And we also have to be sure to value what it means to organize and teach Black children, Black students, Black faculty, Black parents, and Black community to organize together to make the demands that will actually create schools as safe and nurturing and loving spaces for our students to step into their fullest selves.
Dr. Abdullah, thank you for sharing that. I'm also a mother. I grew up in Sacramento and I attended Sac City Unified School Districts. I live in the Elk Grove School District currently. And so I completely understand, and it resonates with me that as a mother, above all things, right, we want to see something happen here. Dr. Weber, I want to turn to you. You've stood tall against special interest and you've advocated for the best of our communities. You hold a position that is very much in line with the powers that are in the state of California. So what would you need to see hit your desk? What actions, what policies, what family and community involvement needs to happen to see California make a true commitment to serving the needs of our most vulnerable children?
First of all, I think I want to thank the gentleman for presenting the material that they presented. And I have to say very honestly that nothing new was presented. And I say that because the issue of suspensions and expulsions has been on the agenda of the legislature before I even came to the legislature in 2012. And Mr. Dickinson, who represented Sacramento, had a bill that was to make it so that you could not expel any student in California from any school. And the unions fought that like crazy because they don't believe they can control the schools unless they have the hammer of expulsion and suspension. That is the only tool that they believe they have in relationship to dealing with kids who are defiant much more than anything else. Most of the suspensions are because their kids looked a certain way, or they said something that indicated they had defiance in them. So it is a challenge. And it's interesting to me because I went to a major research conference in New York a couple of years ago, and it was on suspensions and expulsions. And I was shocked when I got there because the leading scholars on suspension and expulsion was the Department of Education in California, and here we had all this data about what was going wrong. And they were there advocating for things, but they had not really advocated at the legislative level. They talked amongst themselves in terms of their research and their scholars. But when it came down to bills that basically talked about suspensions and expulsions, the names were not present in terms of that time of whoever was running the Department of Education. And hopefully that will change, because there has to be, and reckoning the fact that there have to be consequences for the behavior that's occurring. Many schools write policies about no suspensions and expulsions, and then the system turns around and do other things that result in the same thing. So they don't suspend and expel them, they just put them out in the hallway all day long, or they send them to the library all day. And so the kids miss out on instruction from the moment they walk into a school. When I was on the school board, they called me to a meeting. One of my friends said, I want you to come to my office at 8:05, at 8 o'clock when school started. And I went there at 8 o'clock and I said, what do you need? She said, just wait and see. By 8:05, there was at least 20 or 30 Black boys in the library who had been sent to the library to spend the day there doing their work. Now, what can you do in 5 minutes? I mean, what can you do in 5 minutes that would send you to the office on any kind of suspension and expulsion? And usually it resulted because the kid walked in and the teacher said, "Oh, you want to be here today, or you want to be sent out?" He said, "Well, send me out, of course." And so he left immediately to go to the library to spend his day and do paperwork. So, we have to have the kind of reckoning and leadership and accountability for schools that are suspending and expelling kids. It's really about adults feeling that they have no control over our children other than to be punitive. And we have to have better training, no question about better training. But if you train folks and you send them to workshops and seminars as we have and present all this wonderful data about suspensions and expulsions, people go away and say still, yeah, but that's not the kids in my class. That's not little Johnny who's in my class. That's somebody else's children. And so there have to be some consequences. If you were to suspend and expel white kids the way you do Black kids, there would be consequences. There would be long discussions in schools about why their kid is being suspended and expelled. Long discussions why they have to come home for 3-4 days on expulsion because of some small thing. I mean, there would be accountability paid at the school board level and at the superintendent level if those kinds of atrocities happen to other children other than African Americans. But we have believed, and so when we look at George Floyd, this is all a part of the larger picture of perception of African American, particularly African American males, but also females. I mean, the fact that you can abuse and mistreat Black women in schools, as they did here in San Diego, throw the young woman on the floor because she was outside the school gate, and you abuse this young woman. You wouldn't do it to any other young girl. And so we have to have the kind of policies that come forward that make it impossible for people or undesirable for folks to suspend and expel our children for nothing. That's basically it, number one. And then we have to train them and teach them what to do. But those who are unwilling to participate, you can no longer tolerate them in the system. I mean, I always tell people when they fight an issue and they win, well, I say, you may win the battle, but you're losing the war. That's the reality. You're gonna lose the war because your child is in a classroom that's toxic. And no matter how you fight the issue, every little issue is going to be negative, and their self-esteem is going to be destroyed in the process, so that they then become the victim of all of the public school system that's there. And we see that all the time when kids are completely turned off and they're sent somewhere else, and eventually someone who cares about them turns them back on. So we have to have some accountability for that. We can't believe, as you pointed out, the system is not going to correct itself without influence of community and parents and others. But those who are getting involved, those who are forming organizations and want to do something, you need to understand you're going to have to disrupt the system. You can't massage it anymore. It's been massaged enough. We've had enough training and programs and seminars on racism and sexism and all these other isms that's there. But if there are no consequences for it, it's just a matter of people collecting data and information, and our kids will still be abused in the end. And so I haven't seen the decline of all the conversations we've had. The most we've got is people agree not to suspend kindergartners and first and second graders, and yet we still do it. We still do it because we put them in other rooms. We do other things about it. And so as a result, the detriment is done. And when you start suspending and expelling a kid in first and second kindergarten, first grade, it's almost a done deal. It's almost a done deal. You have to do major intervention to get that out of that child, major intervention.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. I think you point to where this conversation needs to head next, and that's accountability. Dr. Lee, can you help us understand the scope of your new position with the California Department of Education as Superintendent of Equity? And I'll let you start there, and then I have a part 2 to that question.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for having me here. And it's been great listening to the talk back and the feedback already. And really part of my work is doing what I'm doing today. It's listening to our stakeholders. And it's really trying to figure out how do we translate all of this rich information from all of our equity stakeholders and folks in the field to policy and practice. So I'm grateful to work for Superintendent Thurman because he does have that legislative experience and he does bring that lens into this role when we're thinking about how to sort of translate this activity into meaningful processes. And so part of my work is to think through what we're doing right now. I did read the report and it is heartbreaking. I mean, I agree with everything that everyone said, in terms of no student. I was a special ed teacher. I had emotional support. And I used to tell everybody, no student wakes up every day, even from 5 years old, and says, I don't like school. It doesn't happen. It's not an automatic response. It gets socialized into them. And I think we have to really talk about that as adults. And now, being in a policy position, how can we shape? And I love the word around disrupt. And so part of my job is to think about, integrating equity into everything we're doing at the department. So that's looking at some of the feedback from the field, all the reports and the data we're getting from a variety of stakeholders. And then it's also looking at how do we look at our current practices. So one of the initiatives that we're doing really and being led by the superintendent is thinking about our own implicit bias issues. What is the staff at CDE doing? So we're getting ready to go do some internal work around there because we agree, we have to look at ourselves and make sure that as we're shaping policies and decisions and thinking about program decisions that we're considering data in a contextual way. So that's sort of the piece that I really love elevating is that, taking this information about suspension for, just Black kids and really making sure people don't see it just as numbers. It says there's people behind these numbers. There's parents and families behind these numbers. And we want to make sure that we're serving them in the process.
Okay, at the beginning of this call, Tony Thurman said he was looking forward to recommendations from this panel. Given what we've learned today and what we've talked about, are there any of the recommendations that have already been presented that you can get behind?
Yeah, I think we're all on board, and we've been talking about the preschool suspension issue for a long time. And I will say that there's a lot of opportunities and I want to sort of maybe think through the recommendations in a few ways. One is how we're supporting sort of programs, I would say financially. So we do have the grant, I think the superintendent sort of mentioned the Learning Community School Success Program grant. That's $29 million that's allocated this year for that cohort. And it really is addressing a lot of the points that you're bringing up. So I would really encourage systems to think about allocating and sort of using those funds around restorative practices. You can talk about culturally responsive, professional development. You could look at ways to disrupt, the issues that are being talked about because I think one of the things we keep talking about is we're really good at identifying a problem, but we need the resources. And one of the things I've learned is a lot of people aren't tapping into some of the existing resources that we have. Additionally, we've been putting out 2 rounds of grants. And when I checked the lists that were identified, we actually gave 4 mini grants to systems that are listed as, some of the top rates of suspension. And that was good to know that systems are starting to think about it. And I think we need to continue to look at how we can support, the ideal that there's alternative ways to manage behavior. So, my background is as a clinical psychologist too. So we're invested in, I think, the question that we have to deal with the issues that are causing the behavior problems. What supports do these children need? What supports does the families that are connected to them need?
Actually, that's very much centered around children and not much around the systems that are enabling sort of folks to get away with targeting and suspending folks. Dr. Howard, I wonder if you have any reactions to what you're hearing Dr. Lee says, and if any of this feels like the right direction.
So yeah, we've got to take a much more multi sort of pronged approach to how we think about this. I do agree that we can't put the labor on children to be different and the labor on families to be different. I think it's about, again, systems change. It's about attitudes, hearts, minds of what people think about when they look at Black children. So for example, one of the things we've talked about is that we need to have a significant way in which we begin to look at this whole idea of willful defiance. There needs to be an expansion of willful defiance being banned across the state. Why do we raise that one in particular? Because we know far too many Black children are sort of used in this sort of amorphous term called willful defiance. There's days I show up at work and I'm willfully defiant. I don't get sent home. There's days our teachers show up at work and they're willfully defiant. They don't get sent home. But the whole idea of subjectivity around discipline is deeply, deeply under sort of examined. The ways in which young white children, I've seen it, can be in AP and honors classes. And if they object to something that they have to do in a classroom, if they argue with their teachers about why they have to carry out a particular assignment, they are applauded and they are commended for being leaders and being able to show agency and be outspoken about what they believe that their education should have or should not have. But then when Black children engage in the same type of behavior where they exert their voice and activate their agency, they are deemed as being willfully defiant or seen as being problematic. It's these kind of cultural nuances that need to be understood. So I think what we've got to start doing, and Dr. Weber talked about this, is we talk about training folks who are in schools. I think about the work that I do, for example, at an institution. We have to think carefully about who we even let into the profession in the first place. Because if we see people who come into this profession who already have deeply seated pathological notions, deficit-based notions of how to see Black families and Black children, we know what the outcomes are going to be. So we put the responsibility on schools to fix folks that we knew were problematic when they came in the first place. So we have to have some more ways in which we regulate the pipeline of who comes in to teach our teachers. We need to rethink the ways in which school leaders have to be so quick to not sort of think that the goal is to get kids out, but to send kids back into classrooms and begin to do that work. So again, the systems have to change. And the other thing we talked about in the report, which is the ways in which a disproportionate number of Black children who are in foster care are suspended. And one of our recommendations was we need to make sure that before any Black child who is in care, who has an open case, is suspended, that his, her, or their social worker is brought in to help bring some clarity to the situation, help provide some insight to make sure that the appropriate supports that need to be in place, that should be in place, are understood by the school. Frequently, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So schools are acting in ways that are punitive, not recognizing that systems are oftentimes failing children from a child protective services standpoint. So I think we got to, again, shift the responsibility on schools, systems, and people in them to do better, as opposed to putting their responsibility solely or primarily on children and families.
Well, and I want to just jump back into that, because I think that wasn't the point I was making. I think in being systems, we have to understand, and I think this was sort of communicated earlier, accountability requires systems to be empowered, and that includes the parents and the systems that they work with, because you have what people were talking about, being more transparent with data. You have to sort of work with systems to talk about what are you going to use with that data that's being transparent? How do you work to change the system? And I think one of the things that we're promoting, particularly with school leaders, is to look at data in context. Is that we've been talking about data. Like I agree with Dr. Weber. Everybody knows these numbers, but we really have to challenge the people. How are you going to do something different? And then we have to start with the leadership to do that. So I'm in total agreement in that sense. And even we have AB 2083. We do have foster, youth, service coordinators. How are people using them? How are we getting them involved in these cases that the resources get connected to the students in real time? So these are the pieces in terms of the system that we have to start really working. So it's a combination. I think we have to empower systems, and that includes includes the parents in the system to have a voice, but also how to change the system that they're working with. You know, it can't just be the leaders. It has to be all of us participating in that.
Dr. Abdullah, you looked up. I wanted to check in with you to see if you had a response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing what's being said about systems, and we have to remember that systems, the job of systems are to entrench themselves. Systems do not change themselves. People change systems. And we have an opportunity, especially in this moment when the world is cracked wide open, when we're in a space where we can reimagine spaces, that we have an opportunity to reimagine what education looks like. We have an opportunity to build new systems. So let's stop tinkering around the edges of systems that are fundamentally flawed, that are set up and by design create conditions where our children are harmed within these systems. And let's completely reimagine what education can look like. In Los Angeles, one of the things that we're really invested in building is community schools, right? Where our children can see schools, can experience schools, beginning with our Black children, as spaces not only of learning, but of creativity and of freedom and of them seeing themselves as change makers. There's so much that goes into reimagining. It's about, yes, ending suspensions, but it's about so much more than that. It's about ethnic studies. It's about moving police off campus. It's about recognizing the power of community-driven public safety models, right? And so I think that there's an opportunity right now for all of us to be awakened and more deeply invested in building, imagining and building new systems.
And Dr. Lee, I don't want to lean on you, but I think you're just the sole person here who has the actual power literally in his hands to affect change. And so I wonder if you have a vision for the future of education for vulnerable students.
And I agree totally with that last statement, is that we have to look at how to reimagine. So the vision, you know, I guess that I would want to share and what we've been talking about at the department is looking at this from a multifaceted perspective. So one is looking at how do we eliminate the fragmentation that's associated with it? How do we position everybody to be empowered to do just what was described, reimagine what the system should be. But we also have to understand that what that reimagine is going to look like is going to be contextual. It's going to be local to those communities. No one size fit all, you know, that's going to resolve the disparities that we've been talking about today, because every community is motivated to do suspensions for whatever reason. We heard a variety just here today. So I think we have to challenge systems to really have that hard conversation. And I think with leaders, we have to, for some of them, we actually have to teach them how to walk through that process, because change is about relinquishing control. And I think for some schools, that's the challenge. They're in control. They control the money, they control the process, they control the hires, they control everything, how to use the money. But now we have to say that if we're really talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, are we going to challenge systems to relinquish some of that control to really create change that's meaningful for the people and the populations that they serve? So that's the vision.
Yeah, and Dr. Lee, when do you expect to have some answers to some of these questions?
Well, we're working on them right now. When you say answers, I would say, you know.
I say that because, and I'll explain a little more. I say that because you say, we're looking at the data, we're asking ourselves these questions. And I'm just wondering, how long does it take to find the answers? How long does it take to act? And what can we expect in 2021 as a step forward?
Well, I would say one is just doing what we're doing now. First, it's just sitting back and collecting the information. I think in terms of what to expect, I would say right now, the commitment to change and then to see how we can partner and to really have a blueprint for what does it mean to reimagine this work. You know, we have to really build a coalition to do that. And I think it starts with conversations like we're having today. So we've convened our first equity summit. And we're looking for some outcomes from that. And we're going to convene more information, you know, so we can actually come up with a blueprint because one of the things that we're thinking about long term is not just how we're recovering from COVID, but how can we transfer the system? So when we're looking at learning recovery, we see this as an opportunity to plan from a lens that will impact these disparities. And one of our primary initiatives is really reducing disproportionality. That's our agenda, and we're really aligning the department. So we're looking at it across the board, and we're aligning. The first step is really aligning the department to make sure we get everybody committed to focusing on that goal. So it's really getting our house in order so we can support the system at large.
Dr. Weber, I want to come back to you as someone who I'm looking to for wisdom. What needs to happen?
Well, I'm going to have to jump off soon because I've got another meeting at the Secretary of State at 3 o'clock, another Zoom meeting. But let me just say that, I'm okay. The fact of the matter is that we when I attend these meetings and I realize I'm getting very old in the process, that we know everything that we need to know, as Ron Edmonds said, to help kids. What we lack is the will. And the reality is that I've discovered, of course, since I was at San Diego State, but even more here at this point, and when I was a member of the legislature and now the Secretary of State, is that we don't prioritize children as first. We build a system around adults. We try to figure out what is it that teachers need, what is it that not what students need, okay, but what teachers need to be in the classroom. And not necessarily what the teachers need to do to respond to the children. And so we have built the system around adults, and those kids who fit into the adult world survive. And I say that because I've often talked about social promotion when I was on the school board. And most people thought I talked about, well, you get to be 8, so you get to move on to 3rd grade. No, I said those kids who are socially acceptable are pushed along, even if they don't know anything. But they're kind, they're nice, they're quiet, they don't be seen. And as a result, you push them along. Kids who are brilliant, who are constantly asking questions and being active in the classroom are seen as disruptions, and are oftentimes their creativity and their brilliance is killed or either dimmed as a result of the system itself. We have to recognize that this system is not designed, as my good friend Joe Johnson talked about, to do anything more than what it's doing. Which means you have to begin to disrupt the system. You have to begin to refocus the system. One of the things that I discovered when I was doing the bill on ethnic studies, and we had worked for 5 or 6 years with the current chancellor and everybody else. And we were stuck because we knew that the Board of Trustees was not going to allow this to happen. Well, after we got it so far, we did that stuff. So then we went the other route, which was the legislative route, and got the governor. And I had to say to him in our conversation is that when you talk about institutional racism, you must break the rules, because the rules of the system says you can only go so far in curriculum if the chancellor and the Board of Trustees allow you to do so. Okay. And the Board of Trustees will put 1 or 2 Black people on it that can always be outvoted. And so you go around and around in circles with this game that we play all the time about systems and people in charge and who's not, and so forth and so on. And I said to the governor, if you're going to fight institutional racism, you're going to have to go at the monster. You've got to go right there in it and say, no, the legislature has a right. We have the will. We've done this stuff. Bam, ethnic studies is required. You've got to disrupt the system. You cannot continue to play the games of the system, because the system's games are designed for the people in the system. So as I look at this, and as I say, it comes out of frustration, because most of you know I've been fighting for this and fighting for that and fighting for these kids and trying, and the system gives you a little bit, but never enough. And it refuses, and then it kills off anything that might be innovative to bring kids forward. And so we have to, as a community, and I say this consistently, we have to demand more for our children in an unapologetic manner. And if that means that, this disruption causes somebody not to be there or someone else to be there, but it has to happen that way, because that's what happens in every aspect of society. When we had problems in San Diego, La Jolla High School, the prime high school, decided they weren't going to do this crazy curriculum that was disruptive to their students. It was dumbed down, it was unacceptable, and they were going to leave the district. Those parents had decided to leave the district, okay? They didn't want them to leave. They signed a special contract with that school that they did not have to do the curriculum that everybody else was doing. For one school. Why? Because those parents were influential, and they decided that they weren't going to take it anymore. And I'm saying to Black parents, when you see what's going on with our kids, we have to say, we're not taking it anymore. You know, we're not taking it anymore, because it's a sham if your kids are there every day and they're not learning. And if the kids are there and you're kicking them out and you're doing this and doing that. So we have to decide that we've had enough, that we have to disrupt what's going on. And so many folks are afraid of that because they don't know what it looks like. But I can tell you, what we currently have is not working. It's not working for the vast majority of our kids. And the system fights every movement. We've been trying to close a prison in California for years. We're finally going to close one prison. I was chair of the budget. We finally closed one prison. Do you know these people are still upset because why? They want the prisons because they want the jobs. And once you keep a prison open, you will fill it. So we've been putting folks out of prison, and now they want to stop closing prisons but if you keep those beds there, those people will fill those prisons. That's just a fact of life. And so we have to have the courage to disrupt what's going on. Parents have to have the courage to fill the school board rooms or whatever it is and demand that their kids be taught. They have to demand it, and that their kids are not tossed out. We're throwing away too many kids every day. And we see this all the time, and we know this data. We see it all the time. We know that schools are a pipeline to prison. We hear all the slogans that we need to have, and yet we still say those slogans, and nobody's outraged. Nobody's upset. Nobody's furious about what is going on with our kids. And I just, you know, I'm not become a cynic, but I surely have. I'm at a point where, you know, whatever works is what we need to do. I'm not paying homage to anything other than kids need to learn, and they need to be successful, because we are the adults and we know what's going on. And we can't wait for another seminar, another conference, another anything, because we've done that. Go pull out all the stuff you've done over the years, all these conferences on equity and equal opportunity, and all of the folks who've made money running seminars and workshops for our county schools that are this schools that are that school. We got all of that stuff. All of that stuff. I've been in more equity conferences in the last few years, and they really are just about, you know, individual learning, basically. And so what I'm saying is that we know what we need to do. The question is if we're going to take the action. And if we're courageous as a community, we will demand action, or we demand somebody else. And if we don't get that, then we demand somebody else. That's what other people do. When they get tired of stuff, and they've tried and tried, they don't just keep trying with the same people. They say, give us a new principal, give us a new school, give us some new teachers. You know, give us a new setting, and that may at least wake some people up to say, well, if you don't at least respond to these issues, these folks will get rid of you. And that's what happens in every other community. And when they don't respond, they get new people, and they know that. And there was a study done that said the reason why some people teach in the Black community is because they know there's no accountability. Yeah. Those white teachers, there's no accountability. They don't have anybody standing on top of them at night. And only if they're really good and exceptional do they want to teach in affluent communities, because they know those parents will be there and help them every step of the way. And so most of our schools have people who love us, but are not necessarily going to always teach us. And those who do teach us are sometimes ostracized and pushed out by others of the school. So we have to demand. We just have to demand it. It's, you know, I can't think of anything else. I don't have any more programs to give you. I don't have more money. I gave $300 million for equity.
Yeah. No, I want to lean into that, Dr. Weber, and I know we're coming to a close. I think we have 5 minutes, and I would like for Dr. Howard and Dr. Abdullah, I see you have, I'm going to assume that's your daughter with you, and I'd love for her to close us out. But if the change is not going to come top down, Dr. Howard and Dr. Abdullah, are there any words of that you can empower the folks watching this to take the power into their own hands and advocate on behalf of themselves, their communities, and their children? Dr. Howard, we'll start with you, and Dr. Abdullah will end with you.
Yeah, it's tough to follow Dr. Weber. I mean, she just laid it out there for us. And so, I mean, the whole idea around the courage to disrupt is what the task is. I just think at the end of the day, many of us have, I mean, I've got 4 children. We got to look our children in the eyes and be able to look at them and know that we have done everything within our collective beings to make sure we give them something better. We have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror to know that we have left no stone unturned, that we have not made any sort of efforts that have not been without our utmost sacrifice to ensure that we have fought, we have battled, we have stood up, we've spoken out to ensure that their humanity is going to be protected and affirmed. And I think that's what it comes down to. When it's all said and done, these are our most cherished possessions, our children. We don't get a do-over. We don't get a rewind. I think we have to be able to look at whatever school systems we're in and demand the very types of realities that Dr. Weber spoke to. If it's sitting in classrooms and watching the level of instruction that they receive, making sure we sit in classrooms. I know I've showed up in my children's classroom to see what they were getting and what they were not getting. It's talking to principals over and over again until something is done right. But then also advocating on behalf of those other Black parents who don't have the flexibility or don't have the know-how, don't know how to navigate these structures, to let them know it's not us just looking out for ours. It's looking out for all of our children, because the minute we're not there, the very injustice that are happening to other people's children will happen to ours. And we also have to make sure that we are the ones who are not putting this labor solely again on our children to speak up about these things, but let us fight those fights. I tell my children all the time, bring it to us and let us fight the fights with the adults, because we know how to make sure that there's accountability. We know the levers that are pulled. At the end of the day, these are our children. And we don't want to be the generation that is look back on a decade from now, 2 decades from now, and say we failed them. That is our ultimate litmus test. Have we made it better for our children than it was for us? Because we stand here today because there were so many men and women who made sure that we had something better for us than they have for themselves. And beyond that, I think it's not a lot more that needs to be said. It's more that just needs to be done.
So with that, if I could just pick up, I really appreciate Dr. Weber's comments and constant fight, as well as the message that Dr. Howard presents of being involved and doing something. I think that we are done talking. We are done planning. We know what we need. We've visioned new systems, and now it's time to build them. And so Amara, my 14-year-old, who I was just speaking of, just walked in from skateboarding because she needs it after Zoom school, right? She got to get some outside time. But I just asked her if she could quickly recap just these victories that we've won that demonstrate that when we're willing to organize and when we fight, we win. So Amara.
So I feel like a lot of the times we don't recognize our victories as much as we recognize the problem itself. So when we do get the victories, we act like, okay, yeah, that happened, but we need to move on. And yes, that's like what we need to do, but we also need to celebrate those victories and remind each other that it's not impossible to make these changes. And us as BLMLA youth have been working with Students Deserve for years now to end random searches and get school police budget dollars invested in Black communities and Black learning resources, and also defunding school police and abolishing school police overall, because we know that that's rooted in the criminalization of Black and brown youth. So
what happened yesterday?
So yesterday, our most recent victory, we actually did make it so that there's no more school police in LAUSD, which was a huge victory for us because there's been so many of our members and peers that have been affected by that system. So we're really proud about that. This summer, we also have ended random searches. No, that was this past school year. So the 2019 through 2020 school year, we ended random searches. And this summer we got $25 million from the school police budget, which was 35% of the school police budget, to invest in our communities and our resources. And then recently we just got an additional $11 million.
And with ASADA.
Oh, so now we're gonna do ASADA. ASADA is an affirmation of strength. We say this at the end of every Black Lives Matter gathering. So we thought it would be appropriate to say now. So we normally start out in a whisper and then yell, but we're just gonna do it one time because it's kind of weird to yell over Zoom. So repeat after me. It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
I'm sorry, I forgot I was only supposed to do it once this time. But yeah.
Ashe.
You know, we're
proud of you.
We are very proud of you, and we know it's no easy feat. Thank you to the panelists, and back to Dr. Wood and Frank Harris.
We just want to thank everyone and for joining, who are participants, and also for our panelists for just bringing the fire and heat and passion, and really just I think the motivation that a lot of people need to just move forward and just do. Right? We need to do the work, and we need to do it now. And I'll just close by saying what we say every single time we meet when it comes to the Black Minds Matter work, and that's that Black lives and Black minds are intertwined. One does not value the life, then they certainly will not value the mind. Have a good day.